Accusations of ethnic cleansing in Myanmar, a political earthquake in Saudi Arabia, and a US president taking on the role of disruptor-in-chief. The events that shook the world in 2017, the killings and persecution of Myanmar's Rohingya Muslims, caused outcry. We ask why there is no significant international action to stop it. Donald Trump upturned 70 years of US policy to recognize Jerusalem as Israel's capital. But how much damage has it done to the system of international law? And a nuclear arms race in North Korea. Have the threats of fire and fury exposed how little the US can do to stop Pyongyang? Hello, I'm Rita Fakhri. You're watching a special program as we look back at some of the year's key developments and the political power plays having the biggest impact around the world. Welcome to the program. Shot, beaten, tortured or burned alive in their homes. The killing and persecution of Myanmar's Rohingya Muslims has been a dark chapter in 20th century history. More than 600,000 people have now fled the country. Rights groups say it could amount to a genocide. It has led to a chorus of condemnation across the globe, but no real action to punish Myanmar. And the country's own Nobel Peace Prize recipient, Aung San Suu Kyi, has been reluctant to act. Now de facto president, she has been criticized for putting politics over principles, as Asad Beg reports.
It's been a human rights crisis that's shocked the world. Over 600,000 Rohingya refugees have crossed the border from Myanmar into Bangladesh. The UN says the Rohingya are fleeing a textbook example of ethnic cleansing.
The humanitarian situation is catastrophic.
The killings have got to stop, and the violence has got to stop.
There is a grave humanitarian crisis underway that requires urgent attention.
But despite many in the international community speaking out against the persecution of the Rohingya, it's been marked by the notable silence of one individual, the de facto leader of Myanmar, Aung San Suu Kyi. Aung San Suu Kyi's stance on the Rohingya issue has led many around the world to question her credentials as a human rights and democracy activist. Some see her as falling from grace. Here at the London School of Economics, students have removed her as honorary president of the Students' Union.
It's important for us to say that her position right now is one of silence and inaction in the face of genocide. And the only way we can make our stance clear and apply the necessary pressure on her to do things that should have been done a long time ago is through acts like this.
And students on campus seem to agree.
We've seen what's happening in Burma with the Rohingya Muslims and how she hasn't really taken action against it.
Someone who's been complicit in the ethnic cleansing of the Rohingya people does not deserve the title of an honorary presidency.
After weeks of silence came this.
We condemn all human rights violations and unlawful violence.
But it wasn't enough. Oxford City Council voted to strip her of the Freedom of the City Award.
We're really appalled that someone who was held in high esteem as a campaigner for human rights has had these atrocities happening essentially on her watch.
The Oxford University College she studied at has now removed her name from the common room and removed her portrait from the entrance. The charity Médecins Sans Frontières has said 6,700 Rohingya Muslims have been killed, 730 of them children. So why is it that there have been no sanctions against Myanmar?
One of the things that the international community is concerned about is that they feel that if they put too much pressure on the government, it's going to undermine it as it's trying to engage in a democratic transition away from decades of military rule. But that's basically an argument that they're prepared to look the other way, even when there's ethnic cleansing against the Rohingya, for what is the so-called greater good of other reforms in the country.
Once the darling of the West, her reputation has been deeply damaged. Aung San Suu Kyi is showing that she is now more politician than peace activist, and to many, she is not the hero she once was.
Well, for more on the international response to the situation in Myanmar, I spoke to Mark Lowcock. He is the head of Humanitarian Affairs and Emergency Relief at the United Nations.
We don't have the freedom of movement or the number of people or the ability to get all our supplies in the way that we would like to. And we've been calling for better access really since these atrocious events from the end of August hit all of our consciousness.
If you haven't been able to see firsthand the evidence of the atrocities that have been so widely documented in numerous reports and satellite images, are you able to ascertain, though, their authenticity? Because you've heard, as we all have, Aung San Suu Kyi, the de facto political leader of Myanmar, deny that any such crimes were taking place.
Well, more than 600,000 people don't up sticks and flee their country on a whim. I sat down with lots and lots of the particularly women and children who'd fled, and I heard exactly the stories everybody else has heard of villages being burnt, of women being forced to watch while their husbands, fathers and sons were killed in front of them, of the most atrocious sexual abuse and rape and really terrible things. And there needs to be, firstly, an end to the violence and the killing. Since the agreement that was signed between Bangladesh and Myanmar was signed, there have been more reports of more violence. There needs to be much better access for humanitarian workers, and then when they want to and when it's safe and when the conditions are right, the Rohingya people must be allowed to go home.
When you talk about the need to stop the killing, yet we've heard statements of condemnations across the world that haven't really done anything to stop the killing. Dozens of human rights organizations, humanitarian aid agencies have signed on to a petition asking for the UN Security Council to take immediate, concerted, effective action to put an end to the violence against the Rohingya people. I wonder, from a humanitarian perspective, to what extent you think it is important for the Council to act decisively now?
Well, the Council members have been focused on this, and of course the way the Council works, they need to reach an agreement, and in particular all the permanent five need to agree on the course of action. In the meantime, one thing that is within the ability of the humanitarian system to do is to meet the urgent essential needs of those hundreds of thousands of people who have fled.
You see, the Council has been focused on this, but there hasn't been any concrete action taken.
It's up to the Council to decide what it's going to do.
But would you like to see them do more?
That's up to them to decide. What I am focused on is within what is within the feasible action of the humanitarian system. We must do everything we can, both to continue to call for better access inside Rakhine, to look after people there as well as we can, but also crucially to look after the people in Bangladesh and to prepare, in particular, ensuring there's an absolutely central role for the UN High Commissioner for Refugees, whose job it is to look after refugees and who do it fantastically well, that they're given the position and the authority they need to have to help prepare for returns in due course.
Under Secretary General, on the situation in Yemen, you have appealed for the full lifting of the Saudi-led blockade on Yemen. You said that 8 million people are right on the brink of famine. You would think that would be enough to get the blockade lifted, but clearly not. How much of it is still in place?
Yemen is a country which imports more than 90% of its food and its fuel and its medicines, and a small proportion of that in recent years has been brought in by aid shipments paid for by generous donors and brought in by UN agencies and NGOs and others. That part of the blockade has been significantly lifted, not fully to the extent that we would like, but significantly lifted.
How much of the imports are coming through, for example?
Well, the humanitarian supplies meet the needs of a modest proportion of everybody in Yemen. The part of the blockade that remains in place and which needs to be lifted if we're not to see the biggest famine the world has seen in many decades are those relating to commercial imports, particularly of food. People need to eat, obviously, and fuel, which is needed for the transportation system. But that blockade needs to be lifted, otherwise we will see a tragedy of epic proportions.
When you say epic proportions, what exactly do you mean?
Population of Yemen is about 27 million people. More than 20 million of them need some sort of help. Of those 18 million or so, don't know where their next meal is coming from. We as the UN are able to feed about 7 million people a month. What about the other 10 million?
Well, you've declined in the past to say whether the Saudi-led blockade violates international law, but is there any denying that it is illegal, given the consequences?
Well, I see there are reports that the British government has raised with the Saudi authorities concern over the legality of what's happening. Wars do have laws, and the rules of war include a requirement to allow humanitarian access to everybody in the place where the fighting's taking place. And you know, it's a fair question as to whether the question the British government's raised is obviously a fair question.
Can you say whether or not what is going on, the blockade, the daily bombing, violates international humanitarian law?
Well, I'm not a lawyer, but you know, what we don't have is the requirement of international humanitarian law to have free, rapid, unhindered humanitarian access. We don't have that, and that's what we need if we're to avoid a tragedy. But this isn't mostly a legal issue.
And that's a key component of international humanitarian law.
This is not mostly a legal issue. This is a human issue. If you visit the hospitals of Yemen, you meet little children, like a little girl called Nora, who I met, 9 years old. She weighs 11 kilograms. That's the weight of an average 2-year-old. All that Nora can do is lie in her hospital bed and weep. There are thousands of children, tens of thousands of children, risk being millions of children in Yemen in exactly her position.
I can understand, though, your reluctance to criticize Saudi Arabia, its allies, I mean, because it would jeopardize, I suppose, in the future, any kind of access or funding. But I just want to put to you what your predecessor, Jan Egeland, has said. He says the blockade is illegal collective punishment. Would you agree?
Well, collective punishment, again, is a legal term. What I'm saying is the laws of war require humanitarian access, and we don't have humanitarian access at the moment of the sort that we need in order to prevent millions of people losing their lives.
So this is in breach of humanitarian law?
Well, as I keep saying to you, I'm not a lawyer.
I just conclude from what you've said.
I'm saying what the laws of war require, and I'm describing the situation that we have. Talk to a lawyer about what the consequences of those two things are.
No, but I think it's quite obvious. I mean, when you say that one of the major components of international humanitarian law is that prerequisite for unhindered access, and you say that you haven't had that kind of access, clearly you put two and two together, and the conclusion's quite clear.
Well, that's what you're doing. Yeah. I'm making the case, the human case, for saving the lives of millions of women and men, and especially children and babies.
The UN's head of humanitarian affairs, Mark Lowcock. Well, this year has seen the United States pull back from a host of international agreements. Deals on climate change, global trade, and Iran's nuclear program were undermined or simply abandoned. And with one other controversial decision, President Trump showed he is prepared once again to isolate himself on the international stage. The decision to recognize Jerusalem as the capital of Israel goes against a series of United Nations resolutions and 70 years of US policy. Jerusalem is a divided city. West Jerusalem has been part of Israel since its creation in 1948 out of the land known at the time as Palestine. The Palestinian land in East Jerusalem and the surrounding West Bank has been illegally occupied by Israel for the past 50 years and is considered by Palestinians as the capital of their future state. Trump's decision prompted outrage amongst Palestinians and condemnation from countless world leaders. The prospect of a peaceful solution after 50 years of Israeli occupation now seems as distant as ever. Our Middle East correspondent, Iolo Abdafid, has more.
Jerusalem is an important city for three faiths, for Muslims, for Christians and for Jews. But in the last 100 years, this city has become heavily politicized because its future depends on so many different countries. And President Donald Trump's announcement that the American administration will now move its embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem is not just about recognizing a building, it's about far more than that. It means that the Americans think that this is the capital of Israel. And this current administration has changed things because of that. What it means is that Palestinians in East Jerusalem now feel that their goal to establish this part of the city to be their capital of the future state of Palestine is open to question. They're fearful it may not happen. And because some countries still don't recognize the state of Palestine, the future for Jerusalem is far more uncertain than it's ever been. The Israelis are happy because they think this is theirs, the whole of the city, and yet here there are 300,000 Palestinians who feel that they live under occupation and they want this to be a part of a final negotiation, a final peace negotiation, and that has been changed because of President Trump's statement.
Well, shortly after President Trump's decision, the UN Security Council met to discuss a resolution that would have made the US move null and void, but the US vetoed that draft resolution. Now, I spoke to the British ambassador to the UN, Matthew Rycroft. Here's what he had to say.
Their view is that they are entitled to move their embassy now, or prepare to do that now, from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem. Our view is that our embassy will remain in Tel Aviv and that the status of Jerusalem as a shared capital for Israelis and for Palestinians should be the result of the final status negotiations.
Do you see the US recognition of Jerusalem a clear case of breach of international law?
I think their view is that it's not a breach of international law. Their view is that it is in line with that their veto of this resolution is in line with their policy and that their policy is legal.
But what is your view? Because it does go against previous UN Security Council resolutions.
Well, our view is that the reason that we're voting for this resolution is because it is in line with the previous resolutions which we also supported.
Well, to talk more about President Trump's decision, I'm joined by Lami Sdiq, a Palestinian-American human rights attorney. And joining us from Washington, D.C. is Michael Del Rosso. He is a senior fellow for Homeland Security at the Center for Security Policy. Lami Sdiq, the U.S. is clearly isolated within the UN Security Council on its decision relating to Jerusalem. The other 14 members voted to nullify the decision. The U.S., of course, vetoed the draft resolution. From a legal perspective, though, how much difference does this make on the ground?
Well, when we're talking about on the ground, I think we first have to address the de facto situation. And the de facto situation is that in the West Bank and in Gaza, Israel practices military occupation for the purposes of colonization. And in what it's called the 1948 territories, or otherwise known as Israel, and this includes West Jerusalem, it's in its final stages of colonization. So we look at UN resolutions, we look at international law, and we look at the treaties. UN resolutions, the primary one is Resolution 181. And Resolution 181 was the one that recognized Israel into the international forum. And when it did that, it also recognized or called for the international administration of Jerusalem, of all of Jerusalem, and it recognized Palestinian sovereignty and their right to remain in Palestine.
As you say, the status of East Jerusalem has been reiterated in countless resolutions. You mentioned one of them, 181. There's 242, 250, 252, 267, 271. I mean, the list really does go on to refer to this as occupied land. Let me turn to you, Michael Del Rosso. Given the fact that so many people around the world see this as a clear violation of international law, many people have called it reckless, dangerous, unnecessary, counterproductive, not in the interest of U.S. National security. Why did Trump choose to make this recognition now when there was clearly not much pressure on him to do so?
Well, it was a running platform point for the president. So he was keeping another campaign promise and making this declaration. The American Congress passed a resolution 20 years ago affirming it as the capital. And what the president did was just to reaffirm a historical fact that for 3,000 years, 1,000 years before the birth of Jesus, 1,400 years before Muhammad, Jerusalem has been the capital of Israel, and and the Jewish people have resided in Jerusalem for 3,000 years.
Well, you refer to that law, which is the Jerusalem Embassy Act of 1995. That also, many people around the world will say, clearly violates international law and norms. And to add to that, no other U.S. president has found it in his interest to recognize Jerusalem despite this law. That must say something, doesn't it?
The president will do what is in the best interest of the United States. The president very much would like to see peace in the Middle East. So the president is reaffirming from a position of strength that he intends to not be an adventurous and to undo a lot of the political machinations that we saw in the previous administration in the Middle East.
But the question is, does it really serve the U.S.'s national security interests, though? How does it?
Israel is a strong partner with the United States, and they always have been, diplomatically and militarily, and the president's affirming that, whereas The losing party was one that would not acknowledge that. So you have a division in American politics where on the Republican side of the aisle, and even some of the Democrats, are strong supporters of Israel. And that's an undercurrent here in America, especially amongst the evangelical Christian community. And so this designation is not meant to be provocative. It's meant to reaffirm a historical fact that for 3,000 years, Jerusalem has been the capital of Israel.
And clearly, let me turn to Lamizdik, though, if I can, on the point that you just made, bringing in the evangelical Christian base. Is Trump essentially speaking to them more than anyone
Absolutely
else?
Catering to that. I mean, talking about fake news, what could be faker news than this proclamation of this mythology that for 3,000 years Jerusalem has been the capital of Israel? Israel has not existed until 1948, first and foremost. At best, historically, there were several hundred years of Israeli or Jewish rule in Palestine. All of this to the side, what we have to operate within are the reality, the facts, and the laws. And the law simply states that Palestinian sovereignty cannot be changed by force, by military occupation. It cannot be recognized. This is a basic tenet of international law, and in order for states to get along equally, what Israel has done is left the native Palestinian population with less than 6% of the land that it originally owned and which it has owned and lived upon for thousands of years. Less than 6%. And it's done that by forced displacement, especially in Jerusalem. Forced displacement is a crime of war when done systematically, as it's been done. I'm going to finish this
And it does go against the Geneva Convention, as
absolutely,
you say.
in violation of the International Geneva Convention. But it's a crime of war, systematically done, as it's been done throughout Jerusalem and throughout Palestine. It's a crime against humanity, one which the U.S. has been sheltering Israel from for the past 50-somewhat years. And Mr. DeRossi was right. This is consistent not only with Trump's position vis-a-vis the evangelical community, but with vis-a-vis the UN and international law. But this declaration, you know, excuse the pun, is a statement that the U.S. trumps international law, trumps human rights, and has nothing to do and is not interested in even diplomatic doublespeak, which it's been engaging in for this long. Right, and I'd like to speak about the peace process.
But no, before we go into the peace process, let's get Michael Del Rosso to react. If international law is not the most important consideration for the Trump administration, surely national security must be, as I was mentioning earlier. Obviously, this has already sparked unrest and violence around the Middle East, but more than that, the U.S. Supreme Court itself, in a ruling two years ago, said, and I quote, that the status of Jerusalem should be decided not unilaterally, but in consultation with all concerned. Otherwise, a unilateral declaration is damaging to the cause of peace and therefore not in the interest of the United States. This is the U.S. Supreme Court. What do you say to that?
Well, I don't agree with many of the Supreme Court rulings, nor with many of the justices. In fact, a lot of them have what could easily be defined as un-American positions on a lot of issues. I personally don't see it as that provocative. If the Middle Eastern Islamic nations want to take it as that, well, that's their issue. President Trump is saying he's going to put the U.S. Embassy in Jerusalem. So that's what he's going to do. Well,
you don't see it as provocative. Let me ask you, Lamizdik, if this could somehow actually be present some kind of a silver lining, however crazy that may sound to you, in the sense that the status quo didn't help the Palestinians very much. The sort of dormant, non-existent peace process allowed the Israeli government to carry on with the settlement activity in the West Bank and East Jerusalem.
Yes. What we're seeing is the unmasking of the U.S. role in this so-called peace process, or the Oslo Accords. And that is to say that the U.S. is not an honest broker of peace, but the U.S. is an honest broker of Israeli expansion. This declaration by Trump and by Michael right now in his statements is a call for violence and an escalation of violence against Palestinians, not just in Palestine and in Jerusalem, but a call and an escalation for violence against Palestinians internationally. It allows us to rely and call on and expect more severe and meaningful international responses against Israel, and no longer relying on the U.S. to broker peace.
Does it also blow open the cover of certain Arab leaders who've been cozying up to Israel, making public pronouncements all the while potentially privately colluding with the Israelis and the Americans to allow this to happen?
Certainly. I mean, this exposes all of the machinations that we've been seeing happen, not just these past few months with Saudi Arabia, Bahrain, the United Arab Emirates, but really for the past few decades. This tit for tat, what kind of funding and protection are these countries and governments and regimes going to get in exchange for their coordination, collaboration, and normalization with Israel? All of this has come to the forefront. And this helps Palestinians repivot their strategy and their alliances and really go back to a mass resistance model of protecting themselves. We go back to international law. Under international law, nothing can alter the relationship of inhabitants to the land and each other. And therefore, Palestinians not only have a right, but they have a duty to protect themselves from that violence. And the international community must now step up to support them in protecting themselves from this escalated Israeli, American, and even Arab violence.
Lamis Deek here with me in the studio, and Michael Del Rosso in Washington, D.C. Thank you both very much indeed. Well, in public, the decision on Jerusalem was condemned by Saudi Arabia. But in private, there have been reports that its leaders have been working with the United States on a new plan for Israel and Palestine. At the center of that, and most of what happens in Saudi Arabia these days, is the Crown Prince. Mohammed bin Salman was promoted this year and is now effectively the country's leader. Radical to some, reckless to others, his policies have shaken the old order. We can now look at how those Saudi shockwaves have created fallout at home and across the region. Well, Prince Mohammed has had the full backing of the US president, who made Saudi Arabia his first overseas destination. But that relationship has caused concern here in the United States, not least because of its support for the war in Yemen. The US military is refueling jets from the Saudi-led coalition as they go on their bombing runs. I spoke to Congressman Walter Jones, who has tried to get Congress to stop US involvement in the conflict in Yemen. He's a Republican, like Donald Trump, but is concerned that Congress is being ignored when it comes to the US's foreign wars.
We have had no debate on our involvement with the Saudis in Yemen. As far as I'm concerned, we've had no debate since 2001 and 2002. 2001 was a resolution to go into Afghanistan, which was to go after bin Laden because of his involvement with 9/11. 2002 was the Iraq War. We have had no policy debate on anything since that time.
But why is Congress only taking notice now? Because as you've pointed out in the past, for almost 3 years, the US military has participated in what you called a brutal campaign in Yemen that violates the Constitution.
Well, this is the frustration of members in Congress in both parties, Republican and Democrat, is that too many times the administration will make certain decisions involving our military around the world, and we're left out of the debate. Because the world since 2001 and 2002 has changed drastically. Yemen is a prime example. We were not involved in Yemen in 2001, 2002, but now we are.
But in fairness to President Trump, it started under President Obama.
Well, it does. In fact, I would say that I was very upset when Mr. Obama took out Gaddafi in Libya without action of Congress. I was very upset when Mr. Trump dropped 59 Tomahawk missiles in Syria without action of Congress. But I blame Congress. We need to force and defend our constitutional responsibility when we're talking about foreign intervention and we're talking about wars. Americans die in wars. I am one that thinks too often we make policy decisions based on outside money coming into the coffers of the Republican and Democratic parties.
Speaking of outside money, $110 billion worth of weapons sold to the Saudis. How concerned are you about this new, very strong support from the Trump administration for the Saudi Arabian monarchy?
Well, I'm very concerned about it. As you know, we worked very hard for 3 years to get the 28 pages from the 9/11 Congressional Inquiry Commission made public to show that the Saudis were complicit in the 9/11 attack on the American people.
But going back, though, to what's going on in Yemen, how complicit does it make the United States if, by your own argument, the daily bombing by Saudi Arabia and its allies in Yemen couldn't happen without the refueling that takes place thanks to U.S. Air Force planes? How complicit does this make the U.S.?
It's unacceptable. We are complicit, but without an action of Congress. We are not meeting our constitutional responsibility of debating all these wars around the world. I mean, I think about the 4 soldiers killed in Niger. I mean, you had Mr. McCain and Mr. Graham, who probably know more about the military than anybody in the House or Senate, and they were saying, well, we didn't know we had soldiers there. I mean, this is where we in Congress are not doing the job that we've been elected to do, and that is to put more pressure on the administration, whether it be Democrat, in this case, Republican.
Is Congress not doing enough of an important job, or is it focusing sometimes on the wrong threats, would you say? Because I want to quote something that you've said in the past. You say people are very critical of the Iranians. I think we have every right to criticize the Saudis as well. Is the U.S. being dragged into Saudi Arabia's aggressive anti-Iran policy in the Middle East?
Well, you know, when Mr. Trump visited Saudi Arabia and did the sword dance or whatever it was called, I mean, to me, too often, we in Congress, because of politics, I'll be honest with you, are not doing the oversight that we need to do in many of these foreign relationships and to make sure that we're doing the checks and the balances that we are asked by the Constitution to do on these relationships.
How detrimental is it to U.S. interests in the region in the long term?
Well, it's very frustrating. I go back to the Bush administration. They were very close to the royal family in Saudi Arabia, and it always goes back to relationships.
Still ahead on this special program, what might be for President Trump? We get the views of 2 seasoned students of U.S. politics. Welcome back. North Korea's nuclear program has been a problem for years. But in 2017, the regime has reached the brink of developing a nuclear missile. A series of launches have shown their weapons are capable of reaching further than ever before. And now, some estimates suggest they are within months of being able to fit one with a nuclear warhead. President Trump may have derided North Korea's leader as Rocket Man, but right now it seems Kim Jong-un has the upper hand. We'll have more on the power politics in just a moment, but first, let's hear the thoughts of one person who knows all about the dangers of North Korea. A young woman who escaped the regime and now lives in exile here in the United States. We have disguised her identity and her voice, but the words are all her own.
I'm one of the lucky ones. My cousin helped me cross the border. At that time, I was prepared to die. If I had been caught, they would have tortured me and continued to punish 3 generations of my family. The last time I talked to my family was 3 years ago through a broker. You can't say anything against Kim Jong-un. It is not possible. He was born with everything he could possibly want. He does not know what it is like to be a normal human. It is either his way or the highway. He constantly threatens to use nuclear weapons against others to attempt to gain legitimacy. A lot of us tried to escape. An estimated 300,000 North Koreans now live in China, and 31,000 in South Korea. Everything is propaganda back home. There's only one TV channel. The regime forces it upon us. I felt threatened, and life did not matter anymore. There was no freedom to choose my future. I decided to leave at any price. Freedom is priceless.
Joining me now to talk more about how to deal with North Korea, our guest Federico Rampini, who covers the UN for La Repubblica, the leading national daily newspaper in Italy, Julia Sen, who is a correspondent for Reuters here in New York, and Ian Williams, a veteran journalist and broadcaster who is currently writing a book on the United Nations. Welcome to all of you. Thanks for being here. Julia, let me start with you. 3 rounds of tough UN sanctions this past year alone met with a 6th nuclear test. Clearly, the international approach not working quite well on North Korea.
Yes, it is not, unfortunately. And the sanctions, as you're aware, it's nothing new to North Korea. And this year, obviously, the hope is as we sanction North Korea more, it'll cripple the North Korea economy and maybe convince them to give up the nuclear missile program. But that hasn't happened. There are many plausible explanations to why it's that way. But one of the reasons that a lot of our sources tell us is North Korea's economy is largely unknown to the Western world. How big is it? I've seen some estimates saying $28.5 billion as of 2016. I've also seen larger, higher estimates as much as $40 billion for 2016. So it's not that transparent of a country, especially to people like us in the Western world. And the second part is sanctions are nothing new to North Korea. And, the country has been dark since the 1990s, and it's entirely possible that the government, the regime, has already developed multiple backdoor trading channels with among a web of brokers or foreign liaisons that could get goods that they need. So we don't know if the sanctions would work in the first place.
Again, a clear case, it seems, Ian Williams, and you've covered the UN over the years, of sanctions not having the intended effect. Sanctions intended to weaken the regime, but having the opposite effect on the population. The High Commissioner for Human Rights just recently warning as well that it is having a devastating effect on some 70% of the population suffering from acute malnutrition.
Well, all sanctions now are designed in the light of the Iraq disaster, where it was quite clear the regime didn't care if people were starving.
So why does the UN continue down this route then?
Well, they've modified it. They've tried to target the sanctions. But there isn't, there isn't a bunch of plutocrat billionaires like in Russia that they can target in North Korea. No, the whole regime is a sort of collective family kleptocracy. And as long as they got what they want, which includes the material for nuclear weapons, it's shown that their ideology is sort of autarkic and autocratic at the same time. They don't really care about the rest.
And so that's
obviously
one part.
They want to help because they do need the country to be strong enough to sustain them.
Federico Rampini, when we look at the Secretariat, the UN Secretary General recently sent the political department's chief, Jeffrey Feltman, who's an American and a former State Department official, to North Korea, the first high-profile visit by the UN in some 6 years. Was he the right choice? Did he make any inroads with the North Koreans?
Well, I think the United Nations are making their best efforts, but I wouldn't really blame them. They have so little leverage on North Korea. I've covered China and the Korean Peninsula even longer than I've covered the UN, and I think the answer must be looked for in Beijing.
So how much of the leverage, though, does reside in Beijing?
A lot more than they want us to believe.
And how are they using it in the Security Council?
Oh, they're not using it in the Security Council. I think they have a very, double-faced approach. They are compliant with the sanctions, and they are in line with the international community here in New York City at the UN Security Council. But what happens in the field is completely different. They are bypassing the sanctions, and I was in North Korea a few years ago, and already when I was there, it was evident that Chinese businessmen were the people pulling the strings, and that there was kind of an improvement of the economic situation due to trade with China, and it's going on and on.
A lot of people are looking at China, Julia Sen, but an ambiguous picture, as you say, Federico. Confused and confusing comes to mind when I think of the US's approach on North Korea. Rex Tillerson, the US Secretary of State, undercut quite blatantly by the White House for suggesting that there could be face-to-face discussions without preconditions. The next day he is rebuffed. Trump has been threatening the total destruction of the country if need be. Very bombastic language. What is the approach when it comes to the US? Is it all that clear?
Well, it is not clear, actually. And I think we can all agree that calling each other by names and other things on Twitter over an international negotiation is never a helpful thing. But Trump cannot give up Twitter, so here we have the situation. And that only makes the negotiation so much more difficult because there are so many uncertain variables. We in the Western world don't know much about Kim Jong-un. Like, we know he likes Swiss cheese, we know he is Dennis Rodman's BFF, but that's about it. We don't know his leadership style exactly.
Don't know much about him, but Ian Williams, does it help to poke him in the eye at every opportunity and call him Rocket Man?
No, I mean, the whole approach has been catastrophic. What he wants above all is respect and stroking. And the US, ever since Richardson basically pulled up his shopping bag and left over the nuclear deal, has consistently spurned him. I mean, the old Cold Warriors have never tried to reach out. And, it is an odious regime, but we can deal with odious regimes elsewhere. We have, allied regimes that chop people's hand off for theft and decapitate them for adultery. And we can deal with them with no problem at all. But it comes to North Korea, it's sudden. Human rights.
Right.
We can't talk to them. And it's a double standard, which everyone notices. We have three countries. We have India, Pakistan, and Israel, all with nuclear weapons. Why should we be singling out one? Unless we take these things into account, we can't negotiate properly with them.
Do you think it is time for the US to negotiate with the North Koreans from what you've seen within the Security Council and its membership? I mean, the White House spokesperson says North Korea is acting in an unsafe way. Privately, are members of the Security Council thinking the same of the White House leadership?
I think that any US administration is probably worried that if they start negotiating with the North Koreans will cheat. They will never, they're not reliable. It already happened somehow under the Clinton administration. It's an old story. So I go back to my initial point. It's not an obsession that I have. I think the solution is in Beijing. And so there, Trump should start his negotiation, and he missed an opportunity in his last trip to China.
He missed an opportunity. Julia Sen, is it fair, though, for the North Koreans to ask for some kind of security guarantees? I mean, the Russians and the Chinese have presented proposals that are known as freeze for freeze, where North Korea would suspend its nuclear and missile tests, but where the US as well would curtail its military exercises, which do provoke the North Koreans.
Well, I can't say if it's fair to have that kind of promise, but I don't even think we're there yet, because as you just said, the Western world doesn't even trust North Korea. They're not the most reliable people. And the trigger may be in Beijing, because like you said, China values geopolitical stability very much, especially around its border. And if North Korea were to, let's say, go away or something were to happen to him, to North Korea, the country, then yes, China would face a South Korea and US alliance border, and that's not something they want. So
yeah, and how dangerous is the situation for the rest of the world? Ian Williams, the Secretary General himself, has warned about the dangers of sleepwalking into a war.
Well, it's multiple. North Korea, the worst nightmare for South Korea is North Korea collapsing, and ditto for China. Nobody wants a country like this to suddenly collapse and have a sort of Iraq situation when people come in from outside and try to stabilize it with lots of people who have been indoctrinated in strange beliefs, or as we look at them. So nobody wants that to happen. And it's much easier to deal with an existing regime that seems to be firmly in control. So if you've got to, then you have to negotiate. What do they want? But the Chinese are playing a double game, of course, because they don't trust North Korea either, but they're terrified that North Korea might collapse on them, which would allow the South Koreans or the Americans up the Yellow River, which we've been there before, with nuclear weapons threatened by the US, remember. We talk about not trusting. Ask the Iranians how much they trust the Americans on the nuclear deal. The trust is a fungible concept around this world.
It is, and quite subjective as well. Ian Williams, Julia Sun, Federico Rampini, thank you all very much indeed for this discussion. Thank you. Now to our final pick, and most presidents in their first year of office would expect to dominate the news here in the US. But Donald Trump is not most presidents. The media has been scrambling to keep up as headlines have come spinning out of the White House at dizzying speed through tweets, leaks, and sackings of senior staff. And casting a shadow over much of it, the investigation into whether Trump or his team colluded in Russian attempts to interfere in last year's presidential election. At the center of that inquiry, President Trump himself. He's dismissed any suggestions he cooperated with Russia as fake news. But some of his closest advisors are involved too, like his son-in-law, Jared Kushner, and son, Donald Jr. They went to a meeting with a Russian lawyer in the hope of getting compromising information about Trump's election rival Hillary Clinton. Former Trump foreign policy advisor George Papadopoulos is cooperating with the investigation. He's admitted to lying about contacts with a Russian known as the Professor, who's thought to be a secret agent. And then there's former National Security Advisor Michael Flynn. He's pleaded guilty to lying to the FBI about conversation with the Russian ambassador and is also cooperating with the investigation. Well, to reflect on what has been a year like no other here in the United States, I spoke to two people who have spent more time than most watching presidents. Alan Lichtman is a renowned author on presidential history who predicted Trump's win. And veteran journalist Eleanor Clift has been covering presidents for the past 40 years. We sat down for conversation and coffee in Washington. Eleanor Clift, Professor Alan Lichtman, thank you both very much for being here. Sure. It's a great pleasure to have you. Let's talk a little bit, Professor Lichtman. You've become quite the predictor professor, right? Everyone's dubbing you as such for having predicted so many of the previous presidents, including Donald Trump, when no one took him or his chances seriously. What made you think otherwise?
Well, first of all, I paid no attention to the polls. I ignored the pundits. I didn't follow the day-to-day events of the campaign. I looked at the big picture following my system, The Keys to the White House. And The Keys to the White House said, the campaign doesn't really matter. The American people every 4 years decide up or down on whether the party holding the White House should get 4 more years. And there were a lot of problems facing the Obama administration. No big triumphs in foreign and domestic policy, an internal struggle between Sanders and Clinton, bad midterm results. So the big picture guided my prediction.
Could you have predicted a President Trump?
No, I was with most of the American people and certainly the analysts watching this race, assuming that this buffoonish billionaire from New York could not win the presidency. And I think after he did win, that many of us have looked back at the way the race was covered and what we missed. And we missed the anger of a certain segment of the American people and their ability to turn out in greater numbers, namely the lower class white working men.
But what Eleanor just talked about is something that made you actually predict that he would potentially win. You said he would win, but that he would also get impeached.
That's right. I made that prediction at exactly the same time in a September 2016 Washington Post interview. Trump noticed the first prediction of his win and sent me a really nice note about it. Congrats, Professor. Good call, with the big Donald Trump signature on a copy of the Washington Post.
You did write a book called The Case for Impeachment, and I wonder how much stronger the case for impeachment, Eleanor, has become now that Robert Mueller is honing in on the Trump administration.
If he goes to the House with charges, it's a Republican House, it's unlikely they would move to impeach the president, and it would take a 2/3 conviction in the Senate And that's not in the cards today, but everything with this president happens at such rapid speed that potentially this could still happen.
And if you're sitting in the Kremlin right now, how would you be feeling?
I think you'd be thinking this is a fiasco and that you, Vladimir Putin, had a hand in turning this country into an argument within itself and upon itself. And I imagine Mr. Putin is pretty happy about what's happening.
If Putin had a hand in making Donald Trump and putting him in the White House, do you think he may have a hand unwittingly in bringing him down, as it were?
Putin's won. He's undermined the Western alliance. As Eleanor's pointed out, he's caused chaos in our country. He's caused us to question our own democracy. That's exactly what Vladimir Putin wanted. And by the way, what has the Trump administration done to guard against hacking into our next election and perhaps into voting machines themselves? Zero. Nothing.
And see what happens, and hopefully come back for a cup of coffee together. Thank you so much. It was fascinating to speak to you both. Thank you. Journalist Eleanor Clift and historian and author Professor Alan Lichtman there, predicting more drama from the White House in the coming year. Well, that's all for the program. From Miri Dafakhri and all of us here, goodbye and thanks for watching.